Hello friends, I've got a new story for you. Let's take a walk and let's assess the extent of the betrayal and draw our own conclusions. Let's go.
There are betrayals that break a man, and there are betrayals that reveal exactly who he is. This story is the second kind. Let's listen.
My wife came home smelling like another man. I said nothing, because the man she was sleeping with used to watch my back in combat, and now he had cameras inside my house. She thought she was helping him destroy me. She had no idea she was handing me exactly what I needed. My name is Cole Ryland. I'm 45 years old. I spent 11 years in a special operations unit before a knee injury pulled me off the field for good. These days I run a tactical training center outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, teaching law enforcement and private contractors the kind of skills that kept me alive in places I can't discuss at a dinner table. It's honest work, hard work, the kind that keeps your hands busy and your mind sharper than it probably needs to be for suburban life. I've been married to Lynette for 16 years. She's 42, sharp-featured, and smart in a way that always made me proud. She manages accounts at a mid-sized financial advisory firm. We have 2 kids, Tyler, 13, and Grace, 10. Good kids, the kind that make you want to be a better man just by looking at them. For most of our marriage, things were solid. Not movie perfect, but real. We argued about money sometimes, about schedules, about whose turn it was to handle the school run. Normal stuff. But somewhere around 2 years ago, something shifted. Subtle enough that I kept telling myself I was imagining it. She started coming home later. Not every night, just often enough that I noticed. She'd walk in with that specific kind of distance in her eyes, the kind that isn't tiredness, but something closer to guilt wearing tiredness as a costume. I'd ask about her day and get 3-word answers. When I reached for her hand, she didn't pull away, but she didn't hold on either. I told myself work stress. I told myself I wasn't being attentive enough. I was good at talking myself out of the truth. The first real signal came on a Thursday in October. I'd had a late class cancel at the training center and came home around 4 in the afternoon. Lynette's car was in the driveway, which was unusual. The house was quiet. I walked in through the garage, set my bag down, and stopped. There was a smell. Not perfume exactly, more like cologne. Something woodsy and sharp that definitely wasn't mine. I stood in the hallway for a solid 10 seconds, just breathing, the way you learn to read a room before you enter it. Lynette came downstairs a minute later, freshly changed, hair still slightly damp at the edges. She smiled when she saw me, a little too wide, a little too fast. "You're home early," she said, moving toward the kitchen like she had somewhere urgent to be. "Class canceled," I replied, watching her. "You okay? Your car's been here since." "Headache," she cut in. "Came home to rest. Feeling better now." I nodded slowly. Didn't push. But I filed it away, the way you file everything when your instincts start talking. 2 weeks later, our neighbor Frank Delgado stopped me in the driveway on a Saturday morning. Frank's retired, keeps odd hours, spends a lot of time on his porch. He's the kind of man who sees things without meaning to. "Hey, Cole," he said, then paused in a way that told me the next part wasn't casual. "Don't know if this is any of my business, but there's been a car parking down at the end of the block a few times this week. Dark blue sedan, no plates I could read. Just sits there for a while. Once I saw the driver watching your house. I kept my expression flat and asked him what the driver looked like. He described a man, broad shoulders, short hair, maybe mid-40s. Said he'd seen him 3 times in the past 2 weeks. I thanked Frank, went inside, and stood in my kitchen for a long time. A man sitting in a car watching my house. Not a realtor, not a lost driver. Someone deliberate. I didn't say a word to Lynette that evening. I just watched her move around the kitchen, laughing at something Tyler said, helping Grace with her homework, playing the part of a woman with nothing to hide. And I thought, I need to know who that man is before I say a single word. That night, after everyone was asleep, I went to the garage, unlocked the storage cabinet I kept bolted to the back wall, and took out the small trail camera I use for property security checks. I mounted it under the eave above the front window, angled toward the street. Then I went to bed. I didn't sleep much, but I was patient. Patience was one of the few things 11 years in special operations had given me that civilian life couldn't take away. The trail camera ran for 4 days before it gave me what I needed. I checked the footage each morning before the kids were up, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee, scrolling through timestamps the way I used to review reconnaissance footage. Most of it was nothing. The mail carrier, Grace's friend from down the street, a delivery van on Wednesday afternoon. But on Thursday evening at 6:47 p.m., the dark blue sedan appeared. It parked at the far end of the block, just inside the camera's range. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there for 41 minutes, engine off, positioned at an angle that gave him a clean sight line to our front door. Then he pulled away slowly, no hurry, like a man comfortable with being invisible. The resolution wasn't perfect, but I enhanced the frame as much as the software allowed. Broad build, short military-style haircut, and the face, partial, three-quarter angle, but enough. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. I knew that face. Not from the neighborhood, not from the training center, from another life entirely. A life that involved early mornings and locations most people never learn the names of, and men who were trained to move through the world without leaving traces. I didn't say his name out loud. I just closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of my kitchen, listening to the house creak around me. That afternoon, I drove to the training center and told my assistant manager to handle the afternoon sessions. Then I drove out to the east side of Knoxville, to a storage unit I'd kept for years, one that Lynette didn't know about. Inside were documents, hard copies of contacts, and a secure laptop I kept for situations exactly like this one. Old habits from old work. I ran the partial plate I'd caught on camera through a contact I still had from my operational days. A woman named Carla who now worked private investigation and owed me a favor I'd never called in. She came back to me in under 3 hours. The vehicle was registered to a Shell LLC out of Nashville. But the LLC had a signatory name attached to a business address. Brent Kirby, Security Consulting, registered 18 months ago. Brent Kirby. I hadn't heard that name in over 7 years. We'd served in the same unit for 3 years. Overlapping deployments, shared safe houses, the kind of trust you build when your life depends on the man next to you. He'd left the unit under circumstances that were officially described as voluntary separation. Unofficially, there had been questions about a mission in which critical intelligence had reached the wrong hands. Nothing was ever proven. Brent walked. I never knew where he landed. Now apparently he'd landed in a sedan outside my house. I drove home on autopilot, my mind working through the geometry of it. Brent wasn't sitting outside my house because of old grudges. Men like him didn't operate on sentiment. He was there because something was ongoing, something with a purpose, and somehow that purpose involved my address, my family, and very possibly my wife. That evening I watched Lynette more carefully than I ever had. She moved through the kitchen with her usual efficiency, talked to Tyler about a history project, reminded Grace to finish her reading. Nothing outwardly wrong, but I noticed small things I've been dismissing for months. The way her phone screen always went face down the moment she sat on the counter, the way she angled herself slightly away from me when she texted, the half-second pause before she answered ordinary questions. After dinner, I offered to clean up and told her to relax. She took her phone to the living room. I stood at the sink with the water running, watching her reflection in the dark window above the faucet. She typed something, waited, typed again. Her shoulders were tight. Whatever the conversation was, it wasn't casual. I finished the dishes and went to check on the kids. When I came back downstairs, she'd already taken herself to bed, claiming a headache for the second time in 3 weeks. I waited until she was asleep, then did a slow walk through the house. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly. Just felt like the right instinct to follow. I checked the common areas, the coat closet, behind the framed photos in the hallway. Nothing unusual, until I got to the living room bookshelf. There was a small gap between 2 books on the middle shelf, a gap that hadn't been there before. I was almost certain. I pulled both books forward and looked behind them. Pressed flat against the back panel of the shelf was a small device, roughly the size of a thick thumb drive, with a tiny pinhole lens facing outward. A camera, professionally installed, not something you picked up at a hardware store. I didn't touch it. I stepped back, kept my breathing even, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Someone had been inside my house. Someone with the skills and the access to install surveillance equipment without leaving a trace. I went back to the kitchen, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and sat down. Brent Kirby hadn't just been watching from the street. He'd been watching from inside. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how deep it went, and how long I've been the last one to know. I left the camera exactly where I found it. That was the first decision. Moving it or disabling it would tell Brent Kirby that someone was onto him. Right now, my biggest advantage was that he believed I was still in the dark. I intended to keep it that way for as long as it served me. The second decision was to call Raymond Stamps. Ray had been my commanding officer for the last 4 years of my service. A hard, deliberate man from rural Georgia who communicated mostly in short sentences and long silences. He'd retired at 54 and now lived on a property outside of Chattanooga, 40 minutes from Knoxville. We stayed in loose contact. Christmas texts, occasional calls when something in the news reminded one of us of a shared history we didn't discuss in detail. I drove out to see him in person. Some conversations don't belong on a phone. He met me at the door of his workshop, wiping grease from his hands, and looked at me the way he always had, like he was reading a report, not a face. "You've got that look," Ray said flatly, stepping back to let me in. "What look?" "The one you had before Kandahar." I sat down on a workbench stool and told him everything. The sedan, the camera, Brent Kirby's name attached to the shell company. Ray listened without interrupting, which was his way. When I finished, he set down the rag he'd been holding and was quiet for a moment. "Kirby," he said finally, and the word came out like something sour. I was never able to prove what he did on the Lushkar op. Never had enough to bring forward. But I knew. He looked at me steadily. He didn't just sell information, Cole. He sold people. And now he's outside your house. Any idea what he'd want from me? I asked. Ray crossed his arms. "Not from you. From what you know. You ran the Renfrew network for 2 years. Those contact lists, those operational protocols, in the right hands, or the wrong ones, that's worth serious money to certain people." I hadn't thought about the Renfrew network in years. It was a compartmentalized intelligence sharing structure I'd helped develop during my last deployment. Complex, layered, and as far as I knew, still partially active. He'd need documentation, I said. Physical or digital. Something I'd keep at home. Ray nodded slowly. "Which explains the camera in your living room." I drove back to Knoxville with a clearer picture and a tighter jaw. Brent wasn't after my marriage. My marriage was just the door he'd chosen to walk through. Lynette, whatever she was or wasn't doing, was part of the access strategy. That evening I sat across from her at dinner and watched her laugh at something Tyler said. And I thought, how much does she know? Was she a willing participant? Or had Brent found a way in that she didn't fully understand? I couldn't answer that yet, but I needed her phone. The opportunity came 2 nights later. She fell asleep on the couch around 10, phone resting loosely in her hand. I eased it free, took it to the kitchen, and went through it methodically. She hadn't deleted everything. There were message threads that had been partially cleared, but the most recent exchange of the contact, saved only as B, was still there. 7 messages over the past 3 days. The content was careful, stripped of specifics. But one message from Brent read, "He keeps work files at the house. Find out where." And Lynette's reply, sent the same evening, "I'll look this weekend when he's at the center." I set the phone down on the counter. Stood there for a full minute with my hands flat on the tile. She knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the full scope of what Brent was. But she knew enough to be looking through my belongings on his behalf. I put the phone back in her hand before she woke up, went upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The anger was there, cold and specific, not the hot kind that makes you do stupid things. I learned a long time ago that the cold kind was more useful. It kept you precise. I made 3 decisions before I turned out the light. First, the storage unit documents were moving to an off-site location Lynette had never heard of. Second, I was going to build a case on Brent, on the surveillance, on all of it, before I made a single visible move. Third, I would call Carla again in the morning and get everything she could find on Roger Stahl, whose name had appeared once in Brent's LLC filing as a secondary contact. There was more to this than one man and one camera, and I wasn't going to move until I could see the whole board. The next 10 days were the longest I'd spent pretending to be someone I wasn't. I went to the training center every morning, ran my classes, came home for dinner, helped with homework. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, I was dismantling everything Brent Kirby thought he had access to. The work files from my home office, operational contact logs, encrypted drives, a physical binder I'd kept from my last year of service. All of it moved to a secondary storage unit I rented under a business name, paid in cash. I replaced the real documents with convincing decoys. If Lynette went looking that weekend, she'd find something, just not anything useful. Carla came back to me on Roger Stahl within 4 days. What she found was ugly. Stahl had a background in financial consulting that read clean on paper, but he'd been named in 2 separate federal inquiries over the past 5 years, both times as an unnamed associate, both times with no charges filed. He ran a small private equity operation out of Nashville that had a pattern of brief corporate partnerships followed by asset liquidation. He was the money side. Brent was the field side. Together, they were running something that used personal leverage, relationships, access, compromised spouses, to extract proprietary and potentially classified information from targets with operational backgrounds. I wasn't the first. I probably wasn't the last. On a Thursday afternoon, I called my mother in Maryville and asked if she could take the kids for a long weekend. Told her I had a work situation that needed full attention. She didn't ask questions. She never did. Friday morning, I dropped Tyler and Grace off with their overnight bags, hugged them both, and drove back to the house. I packed a single bag of my own, transferred it to my truck, and moved into a room I kept at the training center for late nights and early starts. Then I called Lynette and told her I'd be on site all weekend for a certification course. She sounded relieved. I noticed that. Saturday evening, Lynette came home from wherever she'd been. I know, because Carla had someone watching the house at my request. She walked in around 7 p.m. to a dark house. No kids, no husband. Carla's contact said she stood on the front porch for a moment before going inside, and that the lights came on room by room as she moved through the empty space. She called me at 7:22. "Where are the kids?" she asked, and her voice carried an edge I recognized. Not concern exactly, but the sound of someone whose plan has just shifted unexpectedly. With my mother for the weekend, I answered evenly. "I told you I'd be tied up." A pause. "You didn't say the kids are going too. Does it matter?" Another pause, shorter. "No, I wasn't expecting the house to be empty." "Get used to surprises," I replied, and ended the call. I sat in the quiet of the training center office and let that land for a moment. She'd walked into an empty house expecting to search it and found nothing, not even the target she was looking for. Whatever she reported back to Brent tonight would be incomplete and frustrating, which was exactly what I wanted. But that wasn't the only thing I'd set in motion. Earlier that week, I'd contacted a family law attorney named Doug Parrish, a man I knew through a former client, with a reputation for being thorough and private. I hadn't filed anything. Not yet. But I'd laid out the situation and asked him to prepare documentation. When the time came, I wanted to move fast. The empty house was the opening move. Brent and Stahl thought they were running this operation. They thought I was the unsuspecting Mark, too distracted by a troubled marriage to notice the board being set up around me. They had no idea the board was already mine. Carla called me on a Tuesday morning while I was running drills with a law enforcement group at the training center. I stepped off the floor, pulled off my gloves, and answered. "You asked me to keep eyes on Kirby," she said without preamble. "I've got something you need to see in person." I handed the session off to my assistant and drove to Carla's office in East Knoxville, a converted brick storefront she shared with 2 other investigators. She met me at the door and led me straight to her desk without small talk. On her monitor was a still image pulled from video footage. A parking garage, overhead angle, timestamp from 4 days ago. 2 men standing between parked cars. One of them was Brent Kirby, unmistakable even from above. The other was a stockier man in a gray jacket. "Roger Stahl," Carla said, tapping the screen. They met for 22 minutes. Kirby handed him a folder. Stahl handed him a phone. I leaned closer. The angle was good enough to see Stahl's face clearly. 50s, heavy jaw, the kind of man who looked like he'd never done anything wrong in his life and had been doing exactly that for decades. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Parking garage near Vanderbilt. Their meeting spot, apparently. This is the 3rd time in 6 weeks they've used it." She slid a printed sheet across the desk. I pulled Stahl's business registry. He's got a new LLC filed 2 months ago, a holding company. One of the named assets is a property in Sevierville. Residential. Purchased 8 months ago. Sevierville. I repeated. 40 minutes from Knoxville. "I drove past it yesterday," Carla added. "It's occupied. Utilities running, curtains closed. No visible activity, but it's not empty. I stare at the image of the two men for a long moment. Brent had a safe house 40 minutes from my front door. That changed the timeline. He wasn't running this operation remotely. He was staging it locally, which meant he was closer to a move than I'd assumed. "There's one more thing," Carla said, and her voice shifted slightly, the way it does when the information is personal. She opened a second file on her screen. I was running a broader sweep on Kirby's known contacts when I found this. It was a photograph. Long lens, taken from a distance. A backyard. My backyard. Lynette sitting on the patio with a glass of wine. Tyler and Grace visible through the sliding door behind her. I was in the frame too, standing at the grill, back turned, completely unaware. The date stamp was 11 months ago. 11 months. They'd been watching my family for nearly a year before I noticed a single thing. I thanked Carla, took copies of everything, and drove back to the training center. I sat in my office with the door closed and went through the material one more time, slowly, the way you read a map before you commit to a route. That evening I called Ray. "They've got a property in Sevierville," I told him. "Stahl and Kirby are meeting in Nashville, and they have photographs of my family from 11 months back." Ray was quiet for a few seconds. "Then this started long before Lynette got involved," he said. "She might have been the second phase, not the first." That thought had already been sitting in the back of my mind. Lynette had been approached deliberately, probably groomed over time, brought in as an access mechanism once the external surveillance had reached its limits. She might not have walked into this with full knowledge of what she was enabling. It didn't excuse the messages on her phone, but it complicated things. The next morning a notification came through on my trail camera. Motion at the front of the house, 6:14 a.m. I pulled up the feed on my phone and watched Brent's blue sedan roll slowly past without stopping. A scan. He was updating his read of the property. I didn't move. I didn't react. I let him look. But I made a call to Pete that afternoon and asked him to reach out to a federal contact he'd mentioned once, a former colleague now working financial crimes. Off the record, I wanted someone in that world to know Roger Stahl's name before I started pulling threads. The last thing I did that week was go through the house one more time, room by room, this time with a proper RF scanner I borrowed from the training center's equipment locker. I found 2 more devices, one in the master bedroom mounted behind the headboard, one in my home office beneath the desk, pointed at the chair where I sat most evenings. 3 cameras total, all installed in the past 4 months, all pointed at spaces where I worked, slept, and talked to my wife. I disabled all 3, replacing each one with an identical-looking decoy I sourced overnight. To anyone checking the feed, the cameras appeared operational. What they were actually transmitting was a static loop recorded from each room, 90 minutes of ordinary household footage, cycling on repeat. Let Brent watch a ghost. The real work was happening somewhere he couldn't see. The letter arrived on a Friday. I came home from the training center at 6 in the evening to find an envelope on the kitchen counter. No stamp, hand-delivered, addressed to me by name. Inside was a single page on the letterhead of a law firm, Wallen Associates, Family Law, Nashville, Tennessee. Stuart Weil. I recognized the name from Carla's earlier sweep. He'd appeared once as a contact loosely associated with Stahl's network, though the connection had looked tangential at the time. The letter informed me that Lynette Ryland had retained Mr. Weil's services and that divorce proceedings had been initiated on her behalf. It cited irreconcilable differences and included a notice that a temporary asset freeze had been requested through the court, meaning portions of our joint accounts had been flagged pending a judicial review. I read it twice, set on the counter, poured a glass of water. Then I called Doug Parrish. Doug picked up on the second ring. I read him the key sections of the letter, and he was quiet for a moment before responding. While as aggressive and he files fast, Doug said, "The asset freeze request is a pressure tactic. It's designed to destabilize you financially before you've had time to organize. But it's not airtight. We can challenge it." A pause. "Cole, this filing happened faster than a normal divorce timeline. Someone prepped the paperwork in advance." "I know," I said. "Then you need to come in Monday morning." First thing, I ended the call and stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment. The filing wasn't Lynette acting alone. Weil was connected to Stahl, Stahl was connected to Brent, and the asset freeze was designed to limit my operational capacity while they made their final push to extract what they actually wanted. The divorce was a weapon, not a consequence. I walked upstairs and knocked on Tyler's door. He was at his desk, doing homework. Grace was across the hall, already in her pajamas with a book. "Hey," I said, leaning against Tyler's doorframe. "How would you two feel about spending next week with Grandma?" Tyler looked up. "Like a school week. I'll sort out the school part," I replied. He shrugged with the casual acceptance of a 13-year-old who trusted his father. Grace called out from across the hall that she wanted to bring her art kit. I told her she could bring whatever she wanted. I called my mother that night, and she agreed without hesitation. Saturday morning, while Lynette was still asleep, I loaded the kids' bags into my truck, drove them to Maryville, and stayed for coffee. My mother watched me over her mug with the quiet perception of a woman who had raised a son who didn't show things on his face. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "you handle it the way your father would have. Straight and clean." "Yes, ma'am," I replied. I drove back to the house and walked through every room one final time. The decoy cameras were running. The real documents were gone. Doug Parrish had everything he needed to counter Wiles' filing by Monday morning. Carla's contact in federal financial crimes now had a folder on Roger Stahl. Sunday evening, Lynette came home from a drive that had lasted most of the afternoon. She walked into the front door and stopped. The house was quiet. No backpacks by the stairs. No sound from upstairs. No smell of dinner. She called out for Tyler. Then for Grace. Nothing. She found me in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the divorce letter in front of me. The color shifted in her face. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but something between the two that told me she recognized exactly what she was looking at.
I have to stop here. His wife didn't just betray him. She was used as a weapon against him, and he still didn't lose it. I honestly don't know if I could do that.
The kids are somewhere safe, I told her before she could speak. Sit down, Lynette. We're going to have the honest conversation we should have had months ago. She sat, slowly, her hands flat on the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. "Stuart Weil," I said, sliding the letter toward her. "You want to tell me who recommended him?" She didn't answer right away, but the silence told me everything the words hadn't yet. Lynette sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting for a verdict she already knew was coming. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't moved from my chair. I'd simply placed the printed summary of her phone messages, the ones to be, on the table between us and waited. She looked at the pages for a long moment without touching them. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "Long enough," I replied. "What I need now is the truth. All of it. Not the version you think I can handle. The actual truth." She exhaled slowly and looked at the far wall. When she started talking, her voice was flat and careful, like someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed but didn't believe in anymore. She said it started 14 months ago at a fundraiser event her firm had hosted downtown. Brent had introduced himself as a security consultant. He was polished, attentive, interested in her in a way she said she hadn't felt in a long time. She admitted that last part without looking at me. They had coffee twice, then dinner. Then it became something she didn't name directly, but didn't need to. I kept my face still. The cold anger was there. I'd learned to use it as fuel rather than let it use me. "When did he ask you about my work files?" I said. Her eyes came back to me, and I saw the shift, the moment where the script ran out and she had to improvise. "About 4 months in," she admitted. "He said he was trying to help a client who had a dispute with a government contractor. He said you might have contacts that could help clarify something." It sounded, I know how it sounds now, but it sounded reasonable at the time. "It sounds like you were being run as an asset," I said flatly. "Because that's what was happening." She flinched. "I didn't know." "You knew enough." I cut in, not harshly, just precisely. "You knew enough to hide the messages. You knew enough to look through my office when I was away. You knew enough to keep the relationship going after he started asking questions about my work." I paused. "What did you find?" She was quiet for a moment. "Nothing. The filing cabinet you keep in the office. The folders inside weren't what he said they'd be. He got angry about it." So she'd looked. She'd actually gone through my things. The decoys had worked, but the knowledge that she'd tried sat in my chest like a stone. "Did he threaten you?" I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at me with something new in her expression, something closer to relief than I expected. "Yes," she said, and her voice broke slightly on the word. "About 2 months ago, when I told him I wanted to stop, that I didn't feel right about any of it anymore. He told me that if I pulled away, he would make sure you found out about everything in the worst possible way. He said he had evidence, photos, messages. He said he'd time it to cause maximum damage. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I was scared, Cole. I know that's not an excuse, but I was genuinely scared of him. I studied her face for a long time. She wasn't performing. I knew what performance looked like on her, and this wasn't it. The fear was real, which meant Brent had been running a layered operation. Use Lynette as access, then lock her in with leverage so she couldn't exit cleanly. It was textbook, cold and professional and absolutely calculated. Stuart Weil, I said. Who gave you his name? She hesitated just long enough that I already knew the answer before she spoke. Brent. Of course he had. The divorce filing, the asset freeze, all of it was Brent's infrastructure, not Lynette's idea. She'd been handed an attorney the same way she'd been handed a reason to feel disconnected from her marriage. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside the street was quiet, the orange light of the neighbor's porch lamp casting long shadows across the lawn. Here's what's going to happen, I said, without turning around. You're going to call while on Monday and dismiss him. You're not going to contact Brent. Not a message, not a call, nothing. And you're going to write down every conversation you can remember having with him, every request he made, every threat. Dates, locations, exact words if you can recall them. You're building a case, she said softly. I've been building it for weeks. I turned to face her. Brent Kirby is not a spurned lover. He's a man who used you to run an intelligence extraction operation against me and against people I have an obligation to protect. What he did to our marriage is personal. What he did to this country's security is something else entirely. I met her eyes. I need to know you're with me on this. Not because I've forgiven you. I haven't, and I don't know if I will. But because doing the right thing now is the only way either of us gets through this with anything intact. Lynette held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, with the quiet resolve of a woman who had finally run out of road in the wrong direction. Tell me what you need, she said. I found Beverly Kirby through property records. She owned a small house in a retirement community outside of Oak Ridge, 45 minutes west of Knoxville. Brent's name appeared in her county records as an emergency contact, which was the thread I'd pulled. I drove out on a Sunday afternoon without calling ahead. If she knew I was coming, she might decline, and I didn't want to give her that option before she'd heard me out. The community was quiet, well-maintained lawns, a small pond near the entrance, residents moving at the unhurried pace of people who had traded urgency for stability. Beverly's house was a beige split level near the back. Window boxes with late-season flowers. A car in the driveway that looked recently washed. I knocked. She answered within 30 seconds. A compact woman of 70 with sharp gray eyes and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time expecting difficult news. She looked at me for a moment. You're not selling anything, she said. No, ma'am, I replied. My name is Cole Ryland. Your son served in my unit about 8 years ago. I need to talk to you about what he's doing now. Something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like a door closing on a room she'd been dreading. She stepped back and let me in. Her living room was orderly. Family photos on a shelf near the window. Brent in uniform, younger, before whatever had turned in him had fully turned. She gestured toward an armchair and sat across from me on the edge of the sofa, hands in her lap. He's in trouble, she said. It wasn't a question. He's going to be, I replied. And the people he's working with will not protect him when this comes apart. They never do. She was quiet for a moment. I haven't spoken to Brent in 4 months. He calls on birthdays, sometimes. Sends money occasionally. I stopped asking what he was doing years ago because the answers were never the truth. She looked at me steadily. What is it you want from me? I want to know if he's ever mentioned a man named Roger Stahl, I said, or a property in Sevierville, or anything about a network called Renfrew. She absorbed each word carefully. At the name Stahl, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That name has come up, she said slowly. Last year, around Christmas, Brent was here for 2 days. He was agitated, more than usual. He got a phone call and stepped outside, but I could hear pieces of it through the kitchen window. She paused. He said, Stahl's timeline is too aggressive. He said it twice. That confirmed they'd been in active coordination for at least a year. The timeline matched everything else. Mrs. Kirby, I said carefully, Your son is facing federal exposure. The activity he's been engaged in crosses into territory that won't be handled at the state level. When investigators start pulling threads, and they will, because I'm helping make sure of it, the question of whether he cooperated early will matter significantly to how things end for him.
He had every right to go in with anger. Instead, he walked in with facts. That's not just strength. That's a different level of man.
Her eyes stayed steady on mine. You're telling me to tell him to turn himself in. I'm telling you that the men he's working with will hand him to prosecutors the moment it becomes convenient for them. I said. Stahl has lawyers. Brent doesn't have that kind of infrastructure. He'll be the one left holding it. She was quiet for a long time. The clock on her mantel ticked. Outside, a bird called once from somewhere near the pond. He wasn't always like this, she said finally, and the words carried the particular exhaustion of a mother who had said them to herself many times. He was a good boy before the service changed something in him, before whatever happened overseas that he never talked about. I know, I said, and I meant it. I'd seen the same change in other men. It didn't make what they did afterward acceptable, but I understood the mechanism. I left her a car with my number. She walked me to the door and stood in the frame as I went back down the path to my truck. Mr. Ryland, she called after me. I turned. If I reach him, she said quietly, I'll tell him the walls are closing. Whether he listens is his choice. I nodded, got in the truck, and drove back toward Knoxville through the flat gray afternoon. Beverly Kirby was not an ally. She wasn't an enemy either. She was a woman standing at the edge of something she hadn't chosen and trying to decide what loyalty meant when the person you loved had stopped deserving it. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to. Everything moved in the same week, which was how I'd planned it. On Monday morning, Doug Parrish filed a countermotion challenging the asset freeze and simultaneously submitted a formal request for full financial disclosure from Lynette's side. Stewart, while had already been dismissed, Lynette had made the call Friday afternoon, and for what Doug told me, while his office had gone quiet unusually fast, which suggested someone had told him the exposure on his end was growing. On Tuesday, Carla's federal contact, a financial crimes investigator she'd referred me to the prior week, made contact with me directly. His name was Holt, and he spoke in the clipped, deliberate way of someone used to making every sentence count. I gave him Pete's documentation on Roger Stahl, the LLC filings, the Nashville parking garage footage, and the connections to Wiles' prior casework. He listened, asked 3 precise questions, and told me to expect contact from his office within the week. On Wednesday morning, Brent's blue sedan appeared outside the house for the last time. I was already gone. I'd seen the camera alert on my phone at 6:09 a.m. and watched the feed from a coffee shop 2 miles away. He sat for 23 minutes. The lights inside the house were on timers I programmed to simulate normal morning activity. The decoy cameras were cycling their loops. From the street, it looked like a family getting ready for school. Then his phone rang. He answered it, sat for 30 more seconds, and drove away quickly. Not his usual, unhurried exit. Something had spooked him. Beverly had talked to him. I didn't know what she'd said word for word, but the change in his behavior was the evidence I needed. I drove back to the house, made coffee, and waited. The call from Holt's office came Thursday afternoon. A federal task force had opened a formal inquiry into Roger Stahl's financial network, citing evidence of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and, the one that carried the most weight, unauthorized acquisition of materials related to active government intelligence architecture. Brent Kirby had been named as a co-conspirator. Arrest warrants were being prepared. They asked if I would provide a formal statement. I said yes without hesitation. I gave the statement Friday morning at a field office in Knoxville, with Doug present. I walked through everything methodically. The surveillance, the cameras, the decoy operation, Lynette's role, and the coercion Brent had used to maintain it, the parking garage meetings, the Sevierville property. I kept it precise and factual. No editorializing, no anger in the delivery. Just the architecture of what had been done and the evidence I had to support each piece. By Friday evening, Brent Kirby had been taken into federal custody at the Sevierville property. Roger Stahl was picked up at his Nashville office the same afternoon. From what Holt's office told me later, Stahl's attorneys arrived within the hour. But the financial documentation Pete had compiled was thorough enough that the lawyers couldn't make the core charges disappear. Stewart, while was placed under investigation for his role as legal infrastructure in the operation. He wouldn't be practicing family law for a long time. I sat in my kitchen that Friday night with a glass of bourbon and let the week settle around me. Tyler and Grace were still my mother's. I'd pick them up Sunday. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than empty. Lynette had cooperated fully. Her written testimony, delivered to Holt's office through Doug, had added 3 specific conversations with Brent that investigators had confirmed through cell tower data. She'd done what she said she would. It didn't fix what she'd broken. That accounting was still coming. But she'd stood on the right side when it mattered. And I wasn't going to pretend that counted for nothing. I picked up Tyler and Grace on a Sunday afternoon in late October and drove them home through the Tennessee hills with the windows down and the radio on low. Grace fell asleep in the back seat before we hit the interstate. Tyler rode in the front, watching the countryside pass, and after a while he asked me, quietly, whether everything was okay now. I glanced at him, 13 years old, already reading the room with the instinct of a kid who'd been paying attention. It's getting there, I told him. Some things take time to sort themselves out. He nodded like that was a reasonable answer and didn't push further. Good kid. The divorce proceedings moved forward over the following months. Without while, Lynette retained a straightforward local attorney, and the process, while not painless, was honest. Doug negotiated the settlement with the firmness and precision he promised. The asset freeze was lifted within 3 weeks of the countermotion. The financial terms were fair. We agreed on a shared custody arrangement that kept Tyler and Grace in the same school district and gave both of them stability. I didn't hate Lynette. I wasn't going to pretend the betrayal hadn't happened, but I also wasn't going to let it define the next 20 years. We had 2 children together and a long road of co-parenting ahead, and I intended to walk it with the same discipline I'd applied to everything else. Brent Kirby pled guilty to 4 federal counts 8 months later, including conspiracy to misappropriate sensitive government materials. He received a 12-year sentence. Roger Stahl went to trial and lost. His lawyers had been good, but the financial documentation had been better. He drew 15 years. The Sevierville property was seized as a proceeds of crime asset. Stewart, while surrendered his law license, and was indicted on 2 counts of obstruction. His firm dissolved within weeks of the charges being filed. The Renfrew network, the operational architecture Brent had been trying to extract, remained intact. Holt's office confirmed to me quietly, months later, that no materials of substance had been compromised. The decoys had held. Whatever Brent had passed to Stahl before his arrest was worthless. I stood at the back window of my house on a November evening, watching Tyler and Grace kick a soccer ball around the yard as the last light faded over the tree line. The yard looked the same as it always had. The house felt different, quieter, simpler, like a room after furniture is rearranged, and you realize you always liked it better this way. Ray called me that evening, brief as always. Heard Kirby's sentencing came through, he said. 12 years. I replied. A pause. Good. That was it. That was Ray. I finished the call and stood there a moment longer. There was grief still, for the marriage, for the version of my life I'd expected to have. That didn't disappear just because the operational side of things had resolved. Some losses you carry forward, not as weight exactly, but as shape. They changed the outline of you. But I was Cole Ryland, and I'd come through worse than this in worse places. I'd rebuilt before. I knew how. I opened the back door and called the kids in for dinner, and the sound of their footsteps on the back steps was the clearest thing I'd heard in months. Some things you lose. Some things you hold on to hard enough that they hold you back. I was done letting the wrong ones do either.
This story stays with me because it's not really about betrayal. It's about what a man chooses to do when everything he built gets used against him. Cole didn't collapse. He didn't chase revenge for its own sake. He protected his kids, exposed the truth, and walked forward with his dignity completely intact. That's the kind of strength that doesn't make headlines, but it's the kind that actually matters. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.